back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. Back from the Super Bowl, back in the cockpit, back to doing all sorts of things, including our Baltimore positive movement. We're going to be talking more about around here. This guy has been a stranger for the last, 60 days or thereabouts. Usually we don't give him this long off around here, and been about that long since the Orioles did anything business-wise. Most Major League Baseball teams. He is the longtime insider at the Baltimore Orioles as well as the Texas Rangers in Major League Baseball. Has had a whole life over the last 2 decades doing non-baseball related things, but is a professor of sports business at Georgetown and does all sorts of consulting work, including trying to make me smarter at every turn. We welcome our business professor, the good Professor Marty Conway, back on. You can follow him out on Twitter as well as on LinkedIn, and sometimes on a camel somewhere in the Middle East. But, hey, the desert is dry here with Oriole baseball. There's not much to say or talk about. Luke and I have been at it, Marty, but the business of the Orioles, you have excitedly texted me and said, I've got some insights on this. So I'm going to sit here doing a little evening turn here in the WNST studios and have a little Rofo energy drink and say, Marty Conway, tell me something I don't know about Orioles business, man.
Well, I think the phrase is all quiet on the front, which, as you can see, is there is going to be no additional spending on any other free agents or no additions to the roster other than a few minor league invites with a minor league contract with an invite to spring training. And I think there's a few things, we're in transition. The Angelos boys are clearly running the operation now. Peter hasn't been involved substantially for probably a year or two. But I also think that there's some elements that are hanging over that I think contribute, and they're not sexy to talk about necessarily, which is why you won't see them on the sports pages. But I think one clearly is the Masson lawsuit is working its way to a head quietly, and I think,
and it's a lot of money, like they said in Smokey and the Bandit, a lot of money,
It is, and you're looking at several years of payment due. So whether that's $10 million a year or 12, 15, doesn't matter what that number is. You're looking at 5, 6, 7 years worth of that. That's likely to be paid. And then if you, whatever that outcome is, the Nationals are likely to end up on the better half of
Marty,
that.
is there any way the Orioles or not the Orioles, how about this, Angelos, because the money didn't go to the Orioles. The money went to Angelos. It went to Masson. It went to the family. Yep. It went to the owners. It didn't get anywhere near the team, because if it got near the team, they'd have to give the same amount of money to the Nationals. They'd have to cut the money in thirds. Just all the stuff that I've written about that's really thick and heady and dangerous, quite frankly, when you think about it. Is there any chance that Peter was so arrogant as to have spent the money believing he was never going to have to pay these people? Because the money's there. The money was real. The money was real. It's not made up how much money they were actually getting in the 60, 70, 80, $90 million a year splits, knowing that maybe some days the Nationals are going to come back and need 20 or 30 million of that because you shorted them. I've always felt like the bill was going to come due, but the way Peter's lawyers always positioned it, it was always over his dead body, and it was never going to happen. And now, if the bill really is $312 million, can John and Lou just not, write a check and say, we've got that money sitting over here in escrow? I mean, it really would seem to be absurd if they can't pay the bill,
Well, again, depending on how the structure happened, but I would think the circumstance as it stands today is that there wasn't enough runway yet, and I say that because, the Masson agreement originated in, 2006, 7, whatever around that was. And I do believe that it would have taken longer to accumulate. There's two factors. It would have taken longer to accumulate more of that cash flow, if you know what I mean, because 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. So I think there was an accumulation of payout of owner equity that it was substantial. But I think the number of years didn't quite get there yet for them to reach what was expected. And then number two, look, let's be honest. The number of people paying for cable subscriptions has been trending down and increasing in velocity as it's trended down over the last few years.
As predicted here every time we've ever spoken over the last 5 years.
So whatever
right?
those payments were 5 years ago, at maybe 4.5 million subscribers to your cable system, and now that number is less than 4 million or 3.75, or you can run those numbers. I would encourage people, if you're a Comcast subscriber, just, open your bill someday. I know most people don't, but open your bill, and you'll see on page, 5 of the 14-page bill, it will say RSN fees, and you'll know it's one combined number, and I think mine is, like $6 and something, whatever it is. But I only have 2 RSNs. I have Washington, NBC Sports Washington, and I have MASN. And so however you split that up, whether it's 4 and 2, 3 and 3, whatever, those are your numbers. But I do think over time, that cash pile has diminished for some of those reasons, which I think makes this situation all the more perilous at this point, because if there is a decision and it does come down and you're looking at $100 or $200 million over some period of years, past plus future, then I think it resets the whole equation. There's a variety of different ways I think it could go down. It could be such that the Nationals put themselves in such a strong position that maybe they negotiate out of MASN and decide to take their games. The value is to take their games elsewhere, and they are now on their own RSN, whether it's NBC Sports Washington or something else of the sort, or some other scenario like that. But I don't think it's simple. The point being is, I don't think it's simple, and I think it's potentially quite a bit of money, and I think that sort of uncertainty isn't comfortable right now for the organization. And so this year in particular, I think you'll see a much tighter circumstance around expenditures, whether it's for advertising or whether it's for other investment type things, until this is determined, whether that's mid-spring, late spring, whatever it is. Once it's determined, then I think they can make plans around whatever that outcome is. So that's number one. I think that's the number one substantial component that is hanging over. And then number two is, again, don't forget, we are just 3 years away from the expiration of the lease agreement, which was 1992, it was a 30-year lease. These things are not negotiated in weeks or months. They're negotiated in years. And I also think that there will be a lot of focus and attention on what's going to become of that situation. I don't think, you're not going to hear any credible reports about the team leaving, but I do think that there is going to be a substantial negotiation with the Hogan administration as to how much money is going to be made available to the team for repairs, improvements, et cetera, to the ballpark.
How do you think that goes with Larry Hogan, that it didn't go with Paris Glendening or Governor Schaefer or, at any point during the Marty administration or whatever? It is a fascinating case study how much this has changed, Marty, and I think it will be the focus of what you and I talk about mainly over the next 2 or 3 years here, will be where the Ravens are, where the Orioles are, how the tectonic plates have shifted from your era of EBW and Larry Lucchino and a one-horse and orange horse town and Frank Robinson's passing last week, which I wanted to, get some thoughts from you because you were around in '89 and some of the magic that went on with all of that. But before I even get to that with the Orioles, and maybe one does tie to the other with Eddie Murray and Frank Robinson and their involvement, but okay, I'll hear you on the MASN thing. We've been carrying on for 9 minutes, and Marty, you and I have been carrying on for 9 years, literally. About the MASN thing. They don't look interested in selling tickets, right? Other than a bottle of red, a bottle of white, it's Billy Joel every night, and all I hear about is Billy Joel. They got 81 baseball games. They didn't put opening day on sale. They have their fan fest, but nobody's buying tickets, and this is really going to be emptier than even we could have ever imagined it under some sort of worst-case scenario back when you and Janet Marie were putting the bricks together, building the place, right?
Well, I think, again, all this comes back to how much cash flow there is, what are they using it for, and, yeah, we are now, in the month of February, you're not seeing any substantial advertising or marketing campaign. Those cost money. You either have to spend money for that, or use your rights holder stations,
or have a nice guy like me to give you some wink, wink, free media.
Well, look, in the case of Masson, frankly, no one is watching it when there are not baseball games on, so it's really hard to run a marketing campaign on stations that people are generally not watching till there's games. So that's the quandary, right? You generally would run it on your rights holders if people were watching or listening, or you would have to spend marketing money for marketing campaigns and advertising campaigns. So it's pretty clear that they're either going to constrict that to a few weeks in March or whatever they're going to do around that. So I do think that you will see a rather shallow April in terms of people showing up, buying tickets, doing that. All sorts of things could play into that, the weather, how the team gets off to a start, et cetera.
Well, I keep having fun with my wife this week because we were driving around, and she's like, well, at least they still have Adam Jones. And I'm like, honey, they don't have him anymore. And she's like, oh, yeah, I forgot, but he hadn't signed anywhere, right? And I'm like, nobody signed anywhere because they're colluding all over again. So there's that, and there's we're going to dump the DH, and we're going to have a pitch clock, and there's a lot going on here, but none of it smacks of interest in baseball for young people in our marketplace and certainly the one thing we know with this team, they are not going to win. So then I say, what are they going to do? I know they're not going to spend money, and I get that, and I'm good with that. So what are they going to do? And I asked that question of John and Lou Angelo 6 months ago when I wrote my Rocky and Bullwinkle piece. I've asked that of John Vitelin, who I still have not met anyone that has met John Vitelin. Like, literally, I ask often, like, has anybody met this guy yet? He's, like, running the team. Like, everybody I know has met Dick Cass at some point. Now, he's been here a little while, but John Vitelin, is he really running the play? I mean, Marty, I'm not being mean. Do you know something I don't know?
Well, look, what I do know is, he's essentially a chief revenue officer, so sales and all these kind of things. And I do know that they are trying to add some positions there. They took a lease on some additional space in the warehouse, which presumably is for more sales staff to do more telemarketing and kind of things. So the approach that they're taking is something that we probably won't see in terms of ad campaigns or splashy marketing campaigns. That's my take.
Does that work, though, having like another 18 people sitting around on phones, calling people? Are they really going to generate more ticket sales from that aren't feet on the street? And here's really where I get crazy, Marty. This does speak to my wife and Adam Jones and it speaks to Chris Davis and where he is and what they put on the wall and what they're selling and who's coming and why and who's on the field and what players are on the team. I mean, they have an identity crisis here. I know maybe you went through that a little bit in '88 when they were 0-21, but Eddie Murray and Cal Ripken were still banging around and Frank Robinson was still in the dugout. There was something that felt like glue, This doesn't feel like anything. There is no glue here, Like signing Adam Jones and hanging around to him would at least, add some glue for an extra $1 million or $2 million if he were willing to hang out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, they're bereft of any players to put forward. You can't put Chris Davis forward, obviously. Like you said, you don't have Adam Jones. You have some other guys. Dylan Bundy doesn't move for you. Trey Mancini doesn't do it for you. Like, those are not people that are projectable, that are going to be good in any way, marketing or advertising ever. So I think from a player standpoint, they really have nothing, if hardly anything there to speak to. So I think what you'll see is similar to what they've done in the past, which is a lot of game highlights, footage. But then, you got to get pictures of these guys. You got to get, I
don't want to be mean, Marty. You just said from a player's standpoint, they have nothing.
I mean, you don't really.
That's a great tweet.
Like when you typically would say, okay, well, who's going to be on the media guide or things like that, and you don't really have that going into this year. Now, maybe some of these guys will step forward, but, we don't know about Cedric Mullins. You don't know. So you barely even have pictures of these guys playing in uniform last year or video of them doing anything substantial. So that's their challenge. Now, on the other hand, they've got the ballpark. They've got some other assets that I think would resonate with people. But
Billy Joel. Billy Joel's an asset.
Yeah, like I said, I think you're not going to see the overt marketing and advertising campaigns, at least until the season starts. And I think they're going to try to do more with more people, more phone calls, more feet on the street, more digital, whatever that is to do to actually generate, getting some groups, getting some individuals out. So that's their challenge. Like I said, I think just net, you'll see a very shallow April. You'll have a few high marks here and there, but they've got to get these things out. And again, I think it all ties back to cash flow, what the plan is for this year, what some of the overhangs are, and how they proceed on that. That's really what is also playing into this, just as much as, not having recognizable players and all that. I mean, I think they're waiting to see some of the outcomes financially and what that means. Because look, they drew 1.5 million last year. Ticket sales are off by 1 million over the last 4 years. That's a substantial hunk of revenue that's gone. So I do think they're going to have to continue to tighten it, because they may start out below even last year, and then, you'll see what happens.
But this is a different era where there is no hope. But last year, there was still some thought maybe they could steal 85 win. I mean, I didn't think they completely stink last year once they bought the pitching.
Right.
When they bought the pitching late, I was a believer that, maybe. And they still got Machado. Right. There's no maybe right now, bro, right? It's Valentine's Day, pitchers and catchers. Yeah. There's no hope. They haven't had one of these in a long, long time. Been a while for one of these.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think you're more like the Florida Marlins, the Miami Marlins, whatever you call them, a couple other teams like that, where you're not likely to think that you're the Oakland A's or the Tampa Bay Rays, that your roster has the potential to win 80-plus games, even if it's young. In this case, I don't even really think they necessarily know what they have, which is why they've, hired the coaches and staff are all people that you couldn't pick out of a lineup even if you knew much about Major League Baseball. So I think that has a lot to do with where they're headed this year.
The introductory phase.
But there are really a couple big things, I think, that contribute to that. They're essentially below the waterline. Most people probably don't see that, what the impact of those are, and that's where they have to go, and it will be interesting to see. But it's going to be a long season. It's going to be long 2 seasons, or whatever that process is going to be, and who knows what happens in a lot of ways during that 10, 12, 24-month period. So we'll see.
Marty Conway is here. He is the good professor at Georgetown University, and, of course, our business insider for all things sports. Come out, Virginia. Don't let me wait. The little Billy Joel. You heard Billy Joel's playing, right?
I did hear. Yes, I did. And it's interesting because I know he played at M&T 3 years earlier. But one of the things about that, when I was in Texas, we were big into concerts, country concerts, and having all things like that. And one of the things when you want to do something like this, you're at the mercy of whoever's on the road for that year. And the way these guys are, some of them don't go on the road every year, some go every couple of years. And so I know you want to put on shows like this, but at the end of the day, there's only a certain amount of acts that tour every year, and there's only a certain amount of acts that can fill a football or a baseball stadium. And so while I think this is an interesting choice, again, not that exciting, but it's exciting because it's the first concert at the ballpark. So, but you're constricted by who's on the road, and then the number of acts that can actually sell that many tickets in one night. There's just not that many. There's less than 20. And then you have to get a date that works for them. So,
Marty, what's crazy is the TV ad that they put together for it, for the first time ever, Camden Yards will rock. All it does is, we've been under a rock for 27 years, and while Jimmy Buffett and all of these acts have been playing baseball stadiums since last century, we finally decided to get in the game. Yeah. I mean,
they also had
crazy.
And again, just like I said, just from the lease standpoint, the stadium authority controls the stadium on non-game days, so there had to be a negotiation over that, which looks like they've gotten at least one of these through. So, this is a wait and see for each side to see how this works and whether it's going to work, and then this will be a prelude to, maybe 2 years, 3 years from now having more of these. They'll have to see how they work out.
Marty, Frank Robinson passed last week, and, I'm one of those guys that had hundreds of interactions with Frank. Not many of them were good. There was a good Frank. There was a bad Frank. Everyone wrote about that in the aftermath of it. It was fascinating to read the Boswell memories and the Rosenthal memories, and Tommy Love, who's our mutual friend and your colleague as well, and his memories. I have a handful, not many of them, and I sort of left him alone because he wanted to be left alone, and that was our relationship. And that was okay with me because I figure he stirred up life plenty before I came along,
Right. Yeah, no, he was a manager when I was a marketing and promotion person, so I had quite a few interactions with him, mainly around, on-field, pregame, timings, just different things like that. And
that was a good era for Frank, though, right? I mean, your era there, the team was successful. He was positive. He was beloved. You know what I mean? Like, he was a legend walking around managing.
Yeah.
Remember, he ran the place, right? I mean, right?
He picked up the '88 team, whatever, 6 or 7 games into that losing streak, right? And he's essentially, the way he treated it was, these really aren't my guys, so he didn't really take it personally, and I think everybody understood that too. So whatever happened was not a poor reflection on him. And then the next year, clearly turning it around and almost winning an American League East title at that point. And so that's when things really began to change, and you saw his mood swing, move from 0-21 to, that next year, almost winning the championship. But again, he was very professional. I just say that he was very much a baseball-centered person, meaning that he didn't want us to be doing anything that cheapened the players, the game. I mean, he felt free to give us advice, even if we didn't necessarily want it. But you would always you would always listen carefully to what he had to say, because he was speaking from a position of what he felt the game had been and what it had changed to, and he wanted to see some of that frivolity pulled back in, and maybe not quite so much, dancing on the dugout or some other things like that. But he was always straightforward, and I learned a lot from him. And he just was one of those things that you had to build up trust with him. You had to win. You had to get a few things down early and have a good understanding, and then you could ask for more and more later on. But, you would ask him, for example, if he could sign an autograph for somebody that was coming out. He'd say no. First he'd say no, and then you look at him for 2 or 3 seconds, and he'd say, all right, come on, give it to me. Like, it was just, you had to know how to deal with that. Those that ran when he said no, he continued to say no. But if you just were politely persistent, he would say, yeah, okay, give it to me, I'll do it, and whatever. So there was just the kind of give and take that you might expect from a Hall of Famer and somebody that had, such a rich career as Frank did. But he was a tremendous guy to work for as a manager, and I was in the front office type person. And then later on, when he moved up to the front office after he left the playing field, he had a big influence in some of the things that went into Camden Yards, dimensions, different things of the sort. So he had a big influence on the Orioles franchise from the day he joined it until the day he left, frankly.
Last thought on him, and I'll let you go on this, as I brought this up with everyone. When I was a younger person, and I've been on the air for 30 years, when you wanted to reference a great player, an all-time great player who became a manager, and how difficult it is to be Bill Belichick and Tom Brady, right? To be Frank Robinson, the player, and then Earl Weaver, kind of a manager. Ozzie Newsome has kind of pulled that off in some sort of a way, where I would point to him, and Frank Robinson would always be the guy you'd say, well, he wasn't as good a manager as he was a player. Well, of course he wasn't, because look at the player he was, right? But it was always one of those sort of backhanded things that would be said about Frank, because Frank wasn't afraid of how great a player he was to become a manager. He wanted to be a great manager, but, so much more goes into that than you versus the pitcher, right? He can control his own destiny as an individual player. As a manager, you're dealt with what you're dealt with, and I never thought he was a bad manager at all. I thought he was a pretty good manager, because I saw parts of that. I always thought that was sort of an unfair take on him, and sort of an easy place to grasp at poking at Frank, Yeah,
no, I think you're right. I mean, I think on the continuum of managers, Frank was a really good manager in terms of, overall baseball, if you look at all the managers from Major League Baseball on. But I think it was a measurement against expectations that people had as a great player, that he would be able to motivate these guys. And I also think that he felt that way too, that these guys should have been more self-motivated, should have done some things. And so his temperament in that regard, he had a shorter fuse on some of those things that, like I said, he just thought were sort of frivolous as to why would you do this? Why wouldn't you be doing some of the other things? So, look, on balance, his managerial stints in Cleveland and Baltimore and Washington were generally successful. I mean, he was handed awful circumstances in Baltimore and turned those into a pretty good team. I think he was probably disappointed that it didn't get to, manage in Camden Yards, but that's just the way that process worked. But no, overall, as a Major League Baseball manager, he was one of the more successful ones, and I always thought that he was underappreciated, and even sort of his reputation as a player. I just think he was undervalued because, again, not that many people actually saw him play. The numbers were smaller. And I think on the continuum of great baseball players, Frank is one of those guys that people don't mention in the headline. They mention it in the subtext or further in the paragraph, with the exception of people who saw him play from, 65 to early 70s or wherever it was. But the farther we got away from that, I just thought the less and less he actually got appreciated as a player. And I never think he got his due really as a manager because he was a really good manager.
Well, part of that is he had statues in a couple of places, and he was the first manager in Cleveland, black manager, all that stuff. But for being a guy who was dealt, and I said I was going to close on this, but I do want to close on this. I know you probably saw that picture of me with Uncle Milty, and I put a picture up of Uncle Milty with Louis Aparicio in the '66 World Series out in L.A. I was actually looking for a picture of Luis and Frank Robinson being contemporaries in '66. I could not find one picture on the internet. I tried to break the internet of the two of them together having a bottle of champagne, playing Pepper on the bench together, anywhere, right? I couldn't find a picture because I was going to sort of portray it in whatever way. But I did find some stories about how uppity Frank Robinson was and how uppity Luis Aparicio was, and it started to become more clear to me, literally, as a 50-year-old man, Marty. I'd never thought about, well, why did Louis Aparicio wind up in Baltimore? Well, he got into a fight with Bill Veeck about money, and he was the guy off the Venezuelan boat that should have just been happy to be in Chicago. And Frank Robinson should have just been happy to be with the Cincinnati Redlegs and getting his contract. And they were malcontents, black, Latin, Venezuelan, whatever. And then I said, well, maybe it's race. Maybe it was Curt Flood. And I'm sure it was more race-related in certain cases. But then I saw what happened to Steve Carlton in Lords of the Realm and realized, the color wasn't black or brown or white. It was green, the whole time. And all the fighting over money, that's how the Orioles were birthed. The Orioles were birthed because Frank Robinson couldn't get along with the Reds. Luis Aparicio couldn't get along with the White Sox. And the Orioles were willing to take on great players, pay him $25 more, get Frank a neighborhood he could live in, right? I mean, famously, Frank had to live in a black neighborhood here, right? And then when he moved into a white neighborhood, they charged him $200 more a month to keep the neighbors from getting uppity. I mean, these stories are crazy to me back in the 60s, but they're made even more profound for me, Marty. My last name's Aparicio. It's kind of the way I wound up in Baltimore, because Louis Aparicio didn't get along with Bill Veeck and Frank Robinson didn't get along with the Reds, right?
Yeah, well, I don't think, in today's context, I don't think we can even begin to appreciate what it was like for either of those two type players, and Frank in particular, to play during that time period. If you just look at the period of the 1960s of a decade, the most tumultuous decade in the history of our country, I'd probably believe. It's certainly, if not the most, one of the most. And to be a prominent athlete during that time, you just go down the list of prominent athletes in the 60s and see, and particularly African-American athletes, and see what they had to endure that we know about, and then times that by 10 or 50 or 100 as to what we don't know about. And only at that point, then I think you can really understand what it might have been like to be just on a regular day in their shoes, forget they were at the ballpark or forget they were playing, but just on a regular, living, going to the store, kids, family, wife, and all that, and what they had to endure that they shouldn't have had to. And I think a lot of that certainly would rub off on you as you got older and older to understand, look, I'm sure what Frank had to go through really shaded how he viewed other players playing for him or players playing against him. And I think he probably had every right to feel that way. We just can't comprehend it today. And no matter how much you read or how much you watch 30 for 30s, you just really can't absorb it because you're